Our neighbours at the City Mission serve dinner every night of the week. What is served depends on the donations of the day. Sometimes there's plenty, sometimes there's not. But last Tuesday evening, the food that was served was a bit special. Rather than coming in and lining up at the counter for a portion, the City Mission regulars were welcomed to tables set with white tablecloths where they were served a 4-course meal. And they were served by some rather famous waiters. There were TV stars and rugby players and politicians. And those at the table ate food cooked by some really top-class chefs. By all accounts, it was a pretty special night. Those who served were humbled by the experience. The ones who were the waiters were well used to being served at fancy dinners, but this time it was their turn to serve, and they certainly found that experience very humbling. In Jesus' day, the sharing of meals wasn't a really important way of socialising, but meals were very structured affairs. Whether it was a family meal or a gathering of friends or business associates, there was a certain way that it was done. In our gospel reading today, we hear that Jesus was invited to the house of the leader of the Pharisees for a Sabbath meal. So the leader of the Pharisees would have been someone both rich and powerful. So this is not a family tea. This is a highly structured and ritualized meal in the house of the wealthy. Of course, the meal would have been served by slaves and servants. And Luke says Jesus notes how the guests take their places, how they take the places of honour at the table. At any of these meals, there was a hierarchy of seating. The top table was reserved for the top guests, but each table all the way down was ranked. And there was no seating plan and no name cards. It was much more subtle than that. You had to kind of know where you belonged. When the invitation was sent out ahead of time, there could sometimes be included a guest list, so you could kind of figure out where you were in the pecking order. And everyone knew their place. And on the day of the banquet, a messenger would come with a reminder invitation, and then you would come and kind of figure out where you should be. If you were of humble disposition, you would sit lowish in the pecking order, but if you were a bit ambitious, you could probably risk pushing up the ranks a bit and see if you could get away with it. But the risk, of course, was that your host would come and embarrass you and say, "Sorry, can you give your seat to this guest?" And the other problem was that the top table had the better food. The lower table got kind of the cheaper cuts of meat and the cheaper wine. The top table got the really good stuff. So there was also an incentive to, get yourself further up. Now, it seems at first that Jesus is simply commenting on manners and social etiquette, reminding people how they should behave, and he quotes from Proverbs 25, "It's better to be asked, friend, come up higher, than be embarrassed." But Jesus, of course, is not just talking about manners. He goes a bit further and says to the host, "Don't invite your friends to dinner because they will repay you." And indeed, that was the expectation. You invite me, I've got to invite you. Jesus says instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And they were all groups of people who were considered unclean in Jewish law, and so therefore they would be very unsuitable meal companions, especially for a Pharisee. So I'm sure the Pharisee, the host, was thrilled by Jesus' advice. And I've always wondered, after that exchange, where did he put Jesus at the table? Which table did Jesus get to be at? Was he up with the host, or was he kind of bumped down to the bottom after being rude like he was? But meals and banquets are often the subject of Jesus' teaching. Sometimes the banquet is the heavenly banquet of the future. Sometimes it's a way to describe how the kingdom of God is going to be. And sometimes Jesus is simply enjoying a meal with friends. And he, of course, wasn't really interested in people's table manners. He was instead challenging the social order of the day and offering a new model for living. Friend, come higher up. Join us at our table. Local theologian Dr. Rosemary DeWerse said in a recent blog, "Spaciousness is something I believe Jesus invites us into. Spaciousness. As we follow him, we are caught up into the big dreams of God, visions that have room enough for everyone, for every living thing in creation. Following Jesus, we have an opportunity to see things from God's eye view, a perspective of reconciliation and boundless hope. And we can live, even amongst the rubbish and tears and struggle, we can live expectant of Kairos, of the inbreaking of the Spirit who goes before us." So Jesus is doing so much more than reminding us of good table manners. Jesus is challenging us to think about space and hospitality in our own lives personally, in our communities that we belong to, and on a global level as well. Global conversations are so dominated at the moment by the American election and by the Trump mantras about building walls and excluding people of Muslim faith and excluding all sorts of others. And I'm sure all of us sitting here today reject those kinds of politics, but I worry about the public discourse, the public conversation that becomes normalised by what we hear on the news every day. I remember last year when we hosted here a dialogue about housing, there were speakers who shocked us with their stories of racism and abuse from our own communities. And Jenny Broom reminded us last week to watch our language when talking about refugees, to make sure we didn't ever use words like waves of refugees, hordes of refugees, those kinds of words that demean the people that we're talking about. And now this week in France, we've seen Muslim women being harassed for swimming in their modest swimwear. Some of the municipalities are trying to outlaw the burkini, the swimwear designed specially for Muslim women. It's the height of absurdity, and yet exclusion like that becomes the norm. It becomes okay because the leaders are saying it to behave in that way. It becomes all right to exclude and to make our space really small. In our own city of Auckland, as we become incredibly rich with cultural diversity, we have to work at welcoming all to the table. Racism or prejudice can creep very easily into our private and public discourse. As we come to make our choices in the City Council elections soon, listen carefully to the candidates and who they wish to welcome to the table and who they might want to exclude. And then coming back to our neighbourhood, to this place. The City Mission next door not only serves dinner every day, but also lunch, if and when there is food donated. And some members of our church community have suggested that we might take on a Sunday lunch once a month. As we leave our worship here on a Sunday to go off to a cafe or home to a warm lunch, the people who have their lunch served at the City Mission begin to queue next door. So what if once a month we organised ourselves to prepare lunch so it could be served there to our neighbours? Some of us would be able to cook. Others of us can donate the ingredients. Others can assist the mission staff to serve and clean up. We haven't worked out all the logistics yet and quite exactly how we would do it, but we're working on it. So have a think about whether you could be on a team providing that lunch. What could be your contribution? The writer of the letter to the Hebrews says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, For by doing that, some have entertained angels without even knowing it. The writer's referring back to the time when Sarah and Abraham hosted 3 strangers to lunch in the book of Genesis. The strangers told them that they would have a child, and Sarah laughs and says, "Don't be silly, I'm way too old to have a child." But it turns out the angels were right. You never know what happens when you offer hospitality. And we gather around this table every week. It's a table with no name places, no hierarchy, where all are welcome and all are given places of honour. What do we learn as we gather at this table? What are we sent out to do? Who might we go out and welcome and say, "Friend, move up higher, take my place, let me serve you"?